So we are at the Haus der Kulturen der Welt, House of the Cultures of the World in Berlin, at the opening conference for a 2-year series of events that the institution is organizing so as to explore the notion of the Anthropocene. My name is Ursula Heise. I'm professor of English at the University of California, Los Angeles, and I have a cross appointment there with the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability. I teach and do research on contemporary literature and culture, and specifically environmental culture. So the closest association or synonym for the Anthropocene would be domesticated nature, because the Anthropocene really defines a geological period in which humans transform not just the biology of the planet, but also its geology and meteorology. It was really a growing interest in the 1990s in the problematic of the animal. So the question of how we as humans relate to animals, how we're different from them, what we share with them, and what the future of our relationships to animals should look like. This is what led me, on one hand, to become a passionate bird watcher and a keeper of pet birds, but then also to become concerned about biodiversity and the question of how species are disappearing due to human impact at a rate that's really unprecedented, except for the 5 times in the 3.5 billion years of life on Earth where we've had mass extinctions before. This is the 6th mass extinction of species, and of course the first one that humans have triggered. So this is an issue that has interested me a great deal. How will that change the planet, and how do we as humans relate to this? It's not visible to many of us at a grand scale. So what stories do we tell about it? What images do we use to get a sense of what that crisis is? And so that's what gradually led to my interest in environmental change. So it started with an interest in a particular species and group of species, to then an understanding of their ecology, their migrations, that got me interested in environmental issues. And the Anthropocene is really a very recent introduction into the field of thinking about environmental change and ecological crisis. So global ecological crises like climate change, like pervasive toxification, like biodiversity loss are indeed very hard to imagine, and they're hard to narrate in terms of the kinds of stories that we have at our disposal. But scientists have tried to do this for quite some time, and they've been reasonably successful. And there are, of course, and this is the part that particularly interests me as a literary scholar, there are a lot of writers, filmmakers, photographers who have tried to document different parts of the crisis. So in terms of the biodiversity crisis that I've particularly focused on, 2 things have emerged. One is that the interest of the general public and of publications, texts, films, games that are directed toward the general public, the focus tends to be not on the crisis at large, but on a few species that are beautiful, large, charismatic, and that have some kind of cultural meaning. So the kinds of species that people find it easy to relate to. So stories about extinction are usually about tigers, rhinos, elephants, whales, some large birds. They're usually not about plants, even though plants are equally affected by extinction. And they're usually not about unsightly or small animals that we don't like to think about. They're usually not about insects, they're usually not about worms or anything like that. And so when the fate of these large animals is described in photography or in a text, usually what the artists or writers use as their preferred template is what we literary scholars call elegy. So elegy is traditionally a poem of mourning for a beloved person who has passed away, and that template gets transposed onto a symbolic animal. So we mourn the passing of the polar bear, for example. We mourn the passing of the Bengal tiger, and all of the affect of regret the melancholia, the nostalgia for a time when they still had ample room to roam in and spaces to mate and to procreate. That nostalgia expresses itself very clearly both in the photography and in the writing. But many of the photographers, the writers, the filmmakers who work on these problems are also aware that just focusing on individual species really doesn't convey a sense of the magnitude of the crisis, that there are hundreds, thousands of species that are endangered. Something like 17,000 species are listed in one of the categories of endangerment on the International Union for the Conservation of Nature's Red List of Threatened Species. That's an online database that is used by many conservationists around the world. And so for me, it's been interesting to see how artists and writers have actually tried to introduce that mode of the database or the red list, where you just enumerate endangered species, into their works. So you have photographers who will literally take hundreds of pictures of endangered or extinct species, and they'll just juxtapose them, usually photographed all in the same fashion, say on a black or white background. And it's very striking because we're more or less used to seeing higher mammals photographed in this manner, maybe also some birds, but when you see a reptile or an insect shot in portrait style, it's very striking. And when you see hundreds of pictures of endangered animals and plants juxtaposed, that does give a sense of the magnitude of the crisis. Writers tend to alternate between the focus on individual species that they describe in detail and then often just enumerating. Here's 12 other species on the same island that are also endangered. So there's an odd way in which the catalog has been reintroduced into literature as a means of talking about the extent of this crisis. And now this is pretty interesting from a literary historical point of view, because the catalog was actually an important rhetorical device in the ancient genre of the epic. If you'll remember, in Homer's Iliad, there's a catalog that's pages and pages long of all the Greek ships that were stationed before Troy. It's very disconcerting for a modern reader because it doesn't seem narrative. And so thinking about that rhetorical device and about the fact that most of the writers, whether they're fictional writers or nonfiction prose writers, most of the filmmakers, most of the photographers who work on this kind of issue are possessed with a sense that what they're doing their work on is something that the future of the planet is at stake in. So it is really an epic imagination of the environmental project. They usually describe heroic scientists and conservationists doing battle on behalf of endangered species against ignorant authorities in different masses. So it is almost like an epic battle that gets described here. And so what greatly interests me about this is that the very modern device of the database, often the digital database, merges with the old device of epic narrative, and a narrative in which the future of the world is at stake, in which divine or quasi-divine powerful entities do battle with each other over what the planet will become, the way in which they merge in these artworks to then convey a sense of what kind of crisis surrounds us. Whether they're always successful in that is another question. Some of them, I think, are extremely successful. There are some books and films that are very impressive in what they achieve in terms of bringing home a sense of crisis. Others may be less successful, but nevertheless, just from a formal and cultural viewpoint, it's very interesting that you have some of the oldest and some of the newest forms of literary and cultural expression fused in these works. So the work of two photographers or three photographers is actually very impressive on endangered species. The photographer Joel Sartore has done various series of portrait-style photography of endangered and extinct species. One is called just the biodiversity collection, and that's about species in general. It's not specifically on endangered species, but he's done a wonderful series called Last Ones, where he focuses really on the last specimens of various endangered species. And he always photographs his subjects against a stark black or white background, no matter what the species is. The reason he gives for that procedure is that he says he wants the viewer to treat all these species equally. So his is an attempt precisely to counteract that tendency to focus just on the big and beautiful and charismatic species. So he'll also photograph a frog or an insect in close-up portrait style to make it clear to the viewer that the fate of that species is ecologically no less important than that of a tiger or an otter or some other large mammal. Another photographer, Susan Middleton, who's collaborated with a third person, David Lichtschwager, has adopted a similar procedure, and she too has photographed endangered species, both plants and animals, in particularly striking fashion. So that in the visual arts, that would be two good examples. In film, of course, one cannot ignore the work of David Attenborough, who has consistently advocated on behalf of nature in general, but has also done any number of amazing documentaries on endangered species. And in writing, mostly I think the books about the biodiversity crisis that have most impressed me are nonfiction books. So one example would be the American journalist David Quammen's The Song of the Dodo, which is a book about extinction, how it works, why it occurs. And in his book you see very typically that alternation between elegy or a tragic mode of approaching individual species, which then alternate with sometimes pages of enumeration of endangered species that tries to bring home beyond the fate of individual species how big the crisis really is. There are other books. Diane Ackerman's, the writer, has an equally interesting book and much more lyrical than David Quammen's that comes in the form of a travelogue where she travels to visit different endangered species around the world. And the travelogue is actually a very common device in the books on this issue, where the journey that the activist or scientist or writer undertakes around the globe becomes a way of structuring that visit to different species. And that allows them to alternate between zeroing in on one species and then explaining how that applies to a continent or a region as a whole. So those would be some of the examples, and all of them do adopt that elegiac or tragic mode that I alluded to earlier. Now, I do think that that is in some ways a problematic mode because it repeats a general story pattern that has been very typical of environmentalist discourse for the last 200 years, really, but particularly since the 1960s, which is to always talk about nature as in decline. If you ask environmentalists, nature is always going to hell in a handbasket. The reasons may be very different. In the 1960s, it was toxification and population growth. In the 1970s, we became concerned about acid rain. In the 1980s, we became concerned about climate change and biodiversity loss. And before climate change, we were concerned about the ozone hole. Now, these are all real crises. These crises are not made up by environmentalists, of course, but it is nevertheless striking that going back all the way to the early 19th century, to the building of the railroad in the United States, or the enclosure of the commons in Britain, which were completely different issues, the same narrative pattern repeats itself. So there's always this nostalgia for a lost nature, a generation or two back, that we seek to restore. Now, I think in many ways that has been a very productive narrative, and it has been a counterweight to more common narratives of technological and social progress. And in many ways, of course, the environmental movement has been a movement of protest or skepticism vis-a-vis modernization, and has been very effective about gathering political forces that in some ways felt unease about modernization and articulating it into a relatively coherent social and cultural and ecological agenda. But the problem is that, on one hand, that isn't the only story we can tell about nature. I mean, there are many other changes that you could talk about. For example, the reforestation of forests in northeastern America, the way in which deforestation rates have recently declined across Latin America, and especially in the Amazon, that tend not to get sufficient attention. The work of environmental historians, I think, has also changed our mind about what nature used to be. So the idea that before Europeans arrived in settler continents such as North America or Australia, nature was just wild and it was untouched by humans has been proven wrong by environmental historians who have shown that actually indigenous peoples had transformed those continents for millennia, in the case of Australia, quite possibly tens of thousands of years, by means of fire management. And they had quite deliberately fostered the presence of certain species and not others, had fostered the growing of certain trees and shrubs and not others. So the landscape that appeared so wild and pristine and untouched to Europeans was in fact no such thing. It was a landscape that had already been transformed by humans for many, many years. So for these various reasons, it seems not appropriate to have a narrative about nature that just looks back to the past of nature as untouched, as pristine, as Edenic, and the present as just a story of deterioration. The other reason is a little more pragmatic, which is that a lot of people are tired of narratives of gloom and doom, as we say in English. That is, the persistent pessimism about the future that emanates from a lot of environmental rhetoric. Certain people will become concerned because of that rhetoric and will become sympathetic to the movement, especially young people. And if you, like me, teach classes regularly to people who are 17, 18, 20, 21 years old, you have to be very careful about painting a persistently gloomy picture of the future. It just ends up paralyzing them and making them feel indifferent about a future that they feel they can't really change because it's already so bleak and so many crucial decisions have already been made. So that's a more pragmatic reason for asking whether there might be other stories that we can tell about nature. And one example that I found particularly inspiring was Douglas Adams and Mark Kerwardin's book, Last Chance to See, which I read after having read books on endangered species and extinction for 2 or 3 years, which was a very depressing experience because the scenario is so bleak. And so here we have a book that emerged out of a series of BBC radio shows that a science fiction writer and a zoologist did together in the late 1980s and then turned into a book in 1990 that resolutely adopts a comic mode to talk about species extinction. Now, you would think, how can you possibly do that? How is it possible to speak about something as sad and as depressing as species disappearing in a funny way and in a way that makes the reader laugh and still be concerned about the fate of those species? And I think it's quite remarkable how Douglas Adams achieves this. He moves away from a tragic template that would say, oh, here are these wonderfully, perfectly adapted natural organisms that go extinct through no fault of their own, just because humans are so stupid and because humans have so much hubris. These animals fall from their high place in nature, as the hero did in ancient tragedy, and they are eliminated. What Douglas Adams says, and the stance that he adopts in his narrative, is that actually most organisms, including humans and including himself, are rather spectacularly ill-adapted to their environments. They blunder all the time. They make mistakes. They go about things in a far too complicated way. And so the question is not, why are they dying out now? But the question is, how have they managed to stay alive this long? My favorite story in that book is that of the New Zealand kakapo. This is a flightless nocturnal parrot, and he goes to some length to describe the elaborate mating rituals of that parrot. So the male digs out this bowl in the ground, and then he sits in that bowl and makes these mating call sounds that are supposed to attract the female. But the frequency of these sounds is such that they carry a very long distance but it's impossible to locate the source. So for the females who actually would like to mate with that male, they can't find him. And so they walk miles and miles during the night, and then they show up at empty bowls. They don't find the male. They return to their own place. And so the mating is incredibly difficult. The other difficulty is that the females come into heat, so to speak. I mean, they're only prepared to go out and search for their male mates after they've eaten the fruit of a particular tree, which only fruits every 2 years. So it's just insanely complicated. And so that's the context in which Douglas Adams says, well, this is a species where you don't wonder why they're going extinct. You wonder, how could they ever survive for this long? And that's a mode that he adopts with regard to humans too, when he describes his own behavior even, when he describes the behavior of other tourists, when he describes the attitudes of bureaucrats. What you get is an image of both the natural and the social worlds as spectacularly unadapted and inefficient in some ways. And so he makes you laugh at these scenarios. At the same time, there is, of course, a great deal of affection, both for the fellow tourists, for these animals that are doing things in such a surprising way, and a sense of wonder that he does nevertheless succeed in generating in the reader, where you wonder, wow, how did this species ever make it for so long? And you realize, well, it's the outcome of a series of historical contingencies that cannot repeat themselves. And so we have to preserve the species, not because it's a tragically fallen kind of organism, but because it came out of a series of coincidences, evolutionary, historical ones, that could never repeat themselves. And so if we don't hold on to this, it's sort of a miracle that cannot ever be reconstituted. And so he, in the end, I think, is very successful at creating the same sense of wonder and the same care for the species he describes, but he does it by making you laugh. Now, that doesn't mean that he doesn't have moments of intense melancholia. Those also occur in the book, and I wouldn't want to leave those out. But the overall mode is that of comedy. If we think about nature as not necessarily in decline, but in a constant process of change, and if we think proactively oriented toward the future about what we would like to preserve in nature and what we want to be present in the nature of the future, that will give us a more activist and a more optimistic view of the future. And I think that's where, to me, as a literary and cultural scholar, the notion of the Anthropocene is productive, because the Anthropocene, if I understand it correctly, seeks not to look back on a nature of the past. It says, no, the nature that we inhabit now is a nature that has been pervasively reshaped by humans, and that is just the point zero, the point of departure that we have to work with. And so the point is not to go back. The point is not to mourn the nature of the past, but the point is to come up with political democratic mechanisms that will allow us as humans, very broadly understood, including all affected communities on the globe, to come together around crucial issues and to figure out what is the nature that we want. And I think that's the real challenge, and that's the political difficulty and challenge for the future, is to come up with institutions and procedures that will allow the people who are most immediately affected by our decisions to take part in them. Because so far, decisions about the future of nature have often been taken by Western elites, by white elites in Europe and North America. And then, of course, a lot of what nature looks like currently is actually not due to anybody's conscious decision, but due to unintended side effects of other things that we were planning to do. So in the future, to have a conversation about this, what are the kinds of things that we can do? What might be unintended side effects? How might we deal with the risks of whatever we plan to undertake? I think is really crucial. And that's, I know, it's fairly vague, but I think the more concrete procedures and more concrete plans will have to be decided on a fairly local basis and with involvement of local communities. We do, however, know some of the general parameters. I mean, we know that we need different kinds of transportation that don't produce as many greenhouse gases as the ones we currently use. We know that the kind of meat consumption that we practice in the West is terrible for the environment, terrible for animals. This is now a pattern of meat consumption that's being imitated by nations that have so far had not adopted them. So we know some of the general parameters of what we need to do, and I think within those general parameters, then it becomes possible to think about concretely, what do we want nature to look like in a particular place? What kind of landscape do we want? What kinds of species do we want to be there, and which ones do we actually not want to be there? And I think that's where I think the notion of the Anthropocene is fairly productive, because it enables, when well used, that kind of discussion and that kind of perspective. One of the questions about the concept of the Anthropocene is whether it has the same political critical force that the environmentalist movement has been able to muster for the last 200 years, and particularly since the 1960s. And I think in its original formulation, as proposed by Crutzen and Stormer, it does not. And I think most of the ways in which it has so far been deployed have not been critical. In fact, or to the extent that they have been critical, they were actually critiques of environmental discourse itself. But I think there is the possibility, obviously, for a critique of capitalism, or at least to link it to a reflection on capitalism through the fact that Crutzen and Stormer see the beginning of the Anthropocene as occurring in the late 18th, early 19th century. So the period of the first industrial revolution, which of course is linked to the explosion of capitalism at the time. So I think the Anthropocene does give us the possibility of thinking critically about whether capitalism as an economic system actually allows for sustainable life with nature for societies around the world over the long term. And I think that is a question that a lot of us environmentalists think about in depth, and that I personally am skeptical about. I'm not sure that capitalism is in the end a sustainable economic system. But in saying that, the other question one has to ask is, so what is the alternative? In other words, if we want to get rid of capitalism, what would we replace it with, and what would the transition look like? And I think that's what's most difficult to imagine right now, because alternatives to capitalism seem to be going out of business rather than into business around the globe. So I think it's not easy to come up with such an alternative, and it's easier to come up with ways of working within the capitalist system and to change it so that it becomes more sustainable, if not sustainable in an absolute sense. But I think we cannot give up the project of trying to come up with alternative economic models. Frederick Jameson, in an interesting book called The Seeds of Time that was published in the early 90s, said that it was strange that in contemporary society it seemed easier for us to imagine the end of nature than the end of capitalism, and that maybe showed a shortfall of our imagination, and I would agree with that.